The hell are you staring at, old man? The shout cracked through. One of them let out a mocking laugh as his hand ripped open the old flannel shirt. The fabric split wide, revealing a black dagger tattoo, burned deep into wrinkled skin with the number 182 beneath it. Nice ink, Grand. The old man didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply looked straight at the man in front of him, and his voice, calm to the point of being unsettling, cut the laughter in half. 182 is the number of men I've killed. The room fell into absolute stillness. He continued, tone steady. And that dagger is the mark of the Navy SEALs. The laughter vanished. The taunts died instantly. Only the sharp clang of a metal spoon hitting the floor echoed through the diner, snapping everyone back to reality. In that moment, every person understood exactly who they had just laid hands on, and that this mistake would not end simply. If you believe that true courage doesn't lie in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories and help us honor the memories, dignity, and quiet heroism of our veterans. No one in the diner moved after that sentence. Silence poured in like a dark cloth being draped over everything. The murmurs, the clinking of silverware, the creak of wooden chairs, all of it vanished completely. The old man still sat there, his shoulders slightly curved by age, yet not trembling from fear, only from that familiar kind of shaking found in the elderly, and in those who have carried war inside their chest for far too long. The morning light slanted across his face, revealing deep wrinkles like dried, weathered cracks, each line holding a piece of memory no one else in that room could ever imagine. He lifted his cup of coffee. A small, slow movement, but in the absolute stillness, it sounded like a quiet declaration that he was still here, still breathing, still surviving everything that once tried to kill him. The heat from the cup brushed against his face. In that fleeting moment, his eyes dimmed, as if the fog of memory was pulling him back to a place far away from this little diner. In the rising warmth, he heard the familiar rumble of explosions, urgent commands over a radio, boots stomping through wet soil, and the ragged breaths of brothers beside him as everything around them collapsed and no one could save everyone. He set the cup down without a single wasted sound. The entire room seemed suspended between two heartbeats, uncertain of what to do. They only watched him, the stillness of his posture, the eyes that had witnessed more deaths than the age of most people in that diner. A gentle draft slipped through, carrying the smell of dust engine oil and the heaviness of something everyone felt, but no one dared to speak aloud. He finally opened his mouth. His voice was soft, but it pierced the quiet like an arrow. Death doesn't care how old you are, only whether you can face it. No one replied. A young waitress scrambled to pick up the spoon that had fallen earlier, but her hands shook so badly it slipped again. A man in the corner rubbed his face, turning away, as if afraid to confront something too big reflected in the old man's gaze. A biker standing closest swallowed hard, the veins on his neck tightening like he was forcing down his own pride. But the old man did not look at them with anger. There was no bitterness in his eyes. Only the exhaustion of someone who had carried too many memories, too many names of those who never came home. A few bikers lowered their heads, not sure if from fear or shame. They couldn't understand how a man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of war could sit so calmly while being insulted. Yet that calmness was exactly what the battlefield had left behind, the kind of stillness only possessed by those who had once stood face to face with death. In that moment, he was no longer the disabled old man in a wheelchair. He became a mirror reflecting everything America tries to preserve, yet so often forgets to honor courage, sacrifice, and the dignity of those who once stood at the final line so that others could keep living without knowing who protected them. He glanced down at his now cold eggs. No frustration, no complaint, just the quiet acceptance of someone who understands that life sometimes takes things from you without asking permission. But beneath that, in his eyes, lived the silhouettes of the soldiers who never came back. Those who once sat beside him shared the same canteen, water-cracked jokes in those moments when gunfire rattled only a few meters away. Now he sat alone, and memory was the only thing that had never betrayed him. The diner felt like it was slowly catching its breath again, yet no one realized that this fragile calm was only the backward pull, right before the real storm arrived. The air in the diner hadn't even warmed again after the old man's cold, steady words, when a biker face flushed with alcohol and arrogance stepped forward and spat out a sentence that tightened the entire room. "Keep talking, when you can't even stand on your own feet." His voice dripped with mockery, stretched long as if trying to carve into the old man's dignity. Without waiting for a reaction, he pushed the wheelchair with a small shove. Just a slight motion, but enough to make the wheels scrape hard across the wooden floor, a sound so sharp that a few customers recoiled instinctively. The cruelty didn't come from strength. It came from the cheap desire to show dominance. The torn flannel shirt still hung open across the old man's chest, leaving the black dagger tattoo and the number 182 on full display. The light hit the tattoo, making it flare for a moment, forcing everyone in the diner to look, even those who tried to avert their eyes. An aged chest, a faded war tattoo, a cold number etched in skin together. They formed a truth that none of the men provoking him had ever come close to touching. The room froze as if time itself had been squeezed shut. Another biker, desperate to hold together the intimidation already slipping from the group, snorted and spoke with forced sarcasm. "So who are you? Some kind of soldier or something?" He tried to look confident, but his eyes couldn't hold steady. The smile on his lips was strained, not amused, like someone who knew he had said too much, but refused to let his pride collapse. The old man didn't flinch, not a single unnecessary movement. He simply raised his head and locked eyes with the one who had spoken. Those aged eyes were bright, reflecting something that didn't belong to a roadside diner, something that came from a place where life and death were separated by half a heartbeat. His voice was low, sharp, like a blade fresh off the whetstone. "Not some kind. The kind." Everyone in the diner heard it, felt it, as if the words sliced a clean line straight through the stale tension trying to hold the room together. The biker's smile faltered, then twisted into a shape that looked a lot like confusion. He tried to laugh louder to drown his own unease, but the sound that came out was thin and hollow, like striking an empty metal can. No weight. No power. Only the emptiness of a man being shaken awake from his own illusion of strength. The customers began recognizing the shift. Not a shift in the old man, he remained still calm, carrying the heaviness of decades, as if it were just another coat on his shoulders. The shift was in the bikers. The same men who had been laughing minutes before but now exchanged uneasy glances. Their eyes darted around the room in restless confusion. They were no longer certain whom they were provoking. No longer certain their jokes were harmless. No longer certain they still held control. A middle-aged man in the corner lowered his head, unwilling to meet the old man's eyes. A young waitress bit her lip, hard hands intertwined like she was trying to steady herself. The humiliation hung in the air, like a thick fog, but it didn't fall on the old man. It fell on the ones who had tried to shame him. His calmness made them small, hollow, unsteady, like children trying to bully someone they didn't understand, until the moment they realized they had stepped far, far beyond their depth. The old man drew a long breath. Not a breath of pain, not fear. It sounded like the weary exhale of someone who had spent too many years tired of ignorance and loud, empty pride. That breath alone was enough to make a few bikers step back half a pace without even realizing they were doing it. The room sank into silence. A silence heavy as stone pressing onto everyone's chest. A silence of dawning truth. A silence of fear without a face. The silence of the moment, when the instigators finally understood they had touched the wrong man at the wrong time in the wrong way. And then, inside that suffocating stillness, something outside began to move. A warning subtle but undeniable that this humiliation was only the beginning of the storm heading their way. In the room, stretched tight by suffocating silence, a middle-aged man sitting by the window finally lowered his newspaper. What seemed like an ordinary gesture carried the heavy weight of someone who understood all too well what was unfolding. His eyes stopped on the black dagger tattoo burned into the old man's chest. One brief glance was enough to drain the color from his face. That wasn't the tattoo of someone trying to look tough. It was the emblem of a unit the entire United States knew, yet very few ever dared to speak of. His hand slipped into his pocket. He pulled out his phone fingers, trembling. Not trembling from fear, but from the realization that he was witnessing something no ordinary person ever wants to believe is real. He lifted the phone, dialing a number without even looking, as if it had been carved into his memory years ago. His voice dropped low and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of an alarm. Seal dagger. 182. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Those 3 words were enough. On the other end, silence not even half a second long yet, it felt as though the entire diner tilted. His phone flickered signal bars vanishing one by one. Then suddenly, the connection snapped back, as if someone on the other side had forced the line open. A deep, cold, unmistakably clear voice came through. Location roadside cafe, south on Route 19, he answered immediately without hesitation. His voice still trembled, but the response was sharp, precise, like a field report delivered under fire. There was no second question, no confirmation. The line cut instantly so quickly that he had to wonder whether the call had even happened or if it was just a sudden gust of wind. He lowered the phone, eyes still wide with quiet shock. Outside the window, the wind shifted direction abruptly, whipping dust into small spirals. No one inside the diner looked out, but the man felt the change in the air, as if the moment he made that call, the sky itself understood that something could no longer be ignored. Inside, the bikers kept laughing, trying to hold on to their swagger, but their laughter sounded as though it came from someplace far away. Crisp yet hollow, loud yet empty. The kind of sound that echoes right before a storm slams a door shut for the last time. They laughed like nothing was happening. Yet the middle-aged man knew the truth that laughter was about to be swallowed whole. He glanced at the old man in the wheelchair. The veteran didn't look back. His eyes remained fixed on his cold eggs, as if the storm that had just been summoned had nothing to do with him at all. It was precisely that calm that made the middle-aged man's chest tighten. He understood one thing with complete certainty: men who carry that dagger and that number never call for help. Someone else always has to call for them. A sudden gust rattled the window pane. Inside, a faint clink came from the abandoned spoon on the table. A young man at the neighboring booth instinctively stepped back half a pace, as though some quiet intuition whispered to him that something was about to enter this room, and something none of the bikers were prepared to face. The tension stretched like a rope drawn to its breaking point. The middle-aged man tightened his grip on his phone. He didn't know who they would send. He didn't know how they would arrive. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity: no one ignores that call. No one disregards the code seal dagger, 182. No one. Outside, the wind grew stronger, sweeping dust into tight spirals. Inside, the bikers' forced laughter continued, but it had begun to tremble, began to lose rhythm, like even their own instincts were warning them that the floor beneath their feet was no longer steady. Something was getting closer, and while the troublemakers still hadn't realized it, the world outside was already preparing to step into that diner, bringing with it a presence that would overturn every illusion of power in a single moment. The sound of engines rumbled from a distance, low and deep like thunder crawling across the sky. But it wasn't the chaotic roar of motorcycles, not the uneven, snarling revs of the biker gang. This sound was steady, deliberate, heavy with purpose. Moments later, 2 black SUVs appeared at the far end of the parking lot, gliding in with a speed that suggested nothing on earth could stop them. Their tires crunched over gravel, releasing short, sharp, decisive hisses, the sound of people who arrive without asking, without announcing, and without needing to be welcomed. People in the diner began to turn their heads. Curiosity lasted only a heartbeat, before dissolving into absolute silence as the SUV doors opened in unison. 8 men stepped out, dressed in black uniforms, each footstep carrying the weight of years of brutal training. They moved like a single current, each maintaining perfect spacing, every gesture tight and precise, as if measured by a clock. No one needed to speak for others to know who they were. Their presence alone declared it. The diner door swung open. The room felt suddenly airless as the man leading them stepped inside. He didn't need an introduction. He didn't need flashy insignias or rows of medals. All he needed was one sweep of his eyes across the room, eyes that weren't searching for a person, but assessing everything out of instinct. The eyes of someone who had once stood in the heart of battle and survived by reading danger faster than it arrived. His voice was low, clear, and carried an authority that allowed no repetition. Step away from him. No shouting, no aggression. But the command shattered every illusion of power the bikers thought they possessed. It carried the weight of men who'd given orders under real gunfire, not in cheap bar brawls. The bikers blocking the wheelchair jerked back instinctively, their feet retreating before their minds even understood why. A few people in the diner finally noticed the small triangular patches on the sleeves of the newcomers. Dark green shapes, simple symbols but filled with meaning. One man exhaled sharply when he recognized them: Navy SEALs. Not the kind sold at flea markets. Not tourist patches. The kind stitched only onto the uniforms of men who had walked a long path through bloodwater and darkness before ever setting foot onto a battlefield. One of them stepped forward, unhurried, not dramatic, just moving with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly whom he was approaching. He stopped beside the wheelchair, and then he knelt. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of respect. Respect so profound that the entire diner bowed their heads without needing to be told. His voice was deep, carrying a reverence no one could mistake. "Sir, may I have permission to stand beside you?" The question, beautiful, humble, weighty as an oath, settled over the room. The old man nodded gently. Not a proud nod, not a performative gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement that somehow held more gravity than any salute. The closest biker felt his knees soften, unsure whether it was fear or something deeper. The presence of the SEALs flooded the diner with an order the bikers had never known. No more laughter. No more dragging boots. No more rank breath from men pretending to be dangerous. Instead, the room fell into a silent orbit around the newcomers' men who didn't need to shove wheelchairs or tear shirts to prove power. Another SEAL, standing slightly behind, placed a hand on the commander's shoulder without speaking. A tiny movement, yet enough for the middle-aged man by the window to understand that everything had shifted. Justice was no longer in the hands of the local police or the diner staff. It had arrived in the form of men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the old veteran. The diner hovered on the threshold of a new storm, and everyone could feel it. This wasn't simply the arrival of a SEAL team. It was recognition. Recognition that the man who had been mocked moments ago was anything but ordinary. He was someone even the strongest warriors honored. And when the commander's gaze moved from the old man to the bikers, the truth began to unfold like a door swinging open, leading the entire diner into a completely different level of gravity. The air inside the diner thickened after the SEAL commander knelt before the old man. Every pair of eyes locked onto them as if the entire world had shrunk down to that battered wheelchair and the aging warrior seated in it. Then the commander rose to his feet, turned toward the stunned bikers, and his first words sliced through the silence like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Do you know what 182 means?" No one answered, not because they didn't know, but because their throats had gone completely dry. The arrogance they carried moments earlier evaporated, as if it had never existed. The commander stepped closer, his gaze sharp as cold steel, offering no room for mercy. It's not a code, not a nickname, not a number meant to scare anyone. He paused for a single breath, then let the next words fall with the weight of stone. It's the number of confirmed kills recorded, verified, and classified by the United States Navy. The diner fell into a silence, unlike fear, a silence born of standing before a truth too immense, too heavy to grasp all at once. The commander looked at each biker one by one, and his stare alone made them afraid to breathe. 182 isn't something to brag about. It's the cost paid so men like you can live safely in this country. Not one biker dared lift his head. One of them tried to speak, but only his lips moved. No sound came out. The commander fixed his eyes on him, his voice dropping even lower. Your entire crew wouldn't survive 10 minutes in the place he lived for a decade. The biker froze. The room did too. The commander continued, and though his tone softened, his words carried more weight than anything he had said before. We know who he is. We know what he did to keep this country safe. And you, he looked at the trembling men in front of him, you just put your hands on a symbol every man on our team was trained to respect from the first day of SEAL training. A profound stillness settled over the diner. No more confrontation. No more noise. Only truth undeniable, and towering the old man before them was not a victim. He was a fortress that many had leaned on to survive. And today the men he once protected had come to stand at his side. One biker tried to step back, but his legs refused to obey. He stared at the old man the way a man stares at something he should never have touched. Around them, the other customers began lowering their heads, not one of them willing to meet the old man's eyes, as if afraid they were unworthy to look at him. The SEAL commander paused, then delivered the final blow. A sentence that locked the truth firmly in place. He carried things on his shoulders that none of you could bear for even a fraction of your lives. No one argued. No one spoke. Only the heavy breathing remained of men who had just realized how small they were when measured against a different kind of courage and a different measure of dignity. In the room, choking on the truth that had just been revealed, one of the bikers suddenly collapsed to his knees before the old man. Gone was the swagger, was the mocking laugh, every ounce of false strength stripped away, leaving only a man trembling with raw fear and shame. His voice escaped him in broken pieces, like a child whose armor had been ripped off. "Sir, I didn't know." That word "sir" caught in his throat, heavy and painfully sincere, forcing several customers to look away because they couldn't bear to witness the shame shining so clearly in his eyes. The old man leaned forward slightly, not with anger, not with accusation. His gaze carried none of the sharpness of vengeance. Instead, it held the weary understanding of someone who had lived long enough to know that every mistake begins with not caring enough. His voice was low-tired, but nowhere near cold. That's the problem, he said, each word dropping slow and deliberate like small stones. You never asked who I was. The entire diner fell silent. No one argued. No one defended themselves, because they all knew he was right. They had looked at him, but they had never truly seen him. They saw the wheelchair, the white hair, the trembling hands, but not the life of a man who had survived places others never returned from. Before the echo of his words faded, a young SEAL stepped forward. No warning. No explanation. A single punch, hard, clean, decisive, drove straight into the biker who had torn the old man's shirt. The impact rang out heavy and sharp, dropping the entire diner into an even deeper layer of silence. The biker fell stunned, clutching his jaw, unable to utter a sound. No one interfered. No biker rushed to help him. No customer tried to stop it. Even the old man didn't flinch. Everyone understood that punch wasn't revenge, it was the final period at the end of a sentence the man had written himself. The air grew thick as lead. Those closest looked down at the floor, unable to meet the old man's gaze, yet equally unable to walk away. They could feel the silence filling the room, not the silence of fear or danger, not the silence of threat. This was the silence of realization, the silence of remorse, the silence of people who had just witnessed a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. The old man raised his eyes, looking at the biker kneeling at his feet, and the SEALs standing behind him, like a quiet wall of protection. His voice was soft, yet heavy enough to make men instinctively stand straighter. I didn't fight you, he said, each word brushing old wounds only those who've been in battle could understand. Because I already fought. For you. A simple sentence, yet more powerful than the punch thrown moments earlier. It broke the biker completely. Tears spilled before he could wipe them away. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, stripped of every trace of arrogance. For the first time that chaotic morning, he truly saw the man he had mocked. A soldier. A protector. A man who had given half his life so he could live long enough to make mistakes like this. Silence stretched on. No one dared break it. The customers bowed their heads. The remaining bikers bowed theirs. And the SEALs behind the old man held their respectful distance as if waiting for him alone to decide what deserved forgiveness and what didn't. In that roadside diner, an atmosphere settled over the room, like an unplanned ceremony, solemn, reverent, weighty. No judgment needed. No accusations required. The truth itself had forced everyone into silence. And from that breathless moment, what happened next would etch itself deeply into a legacy none of them would ever forget. The chaos of the morning finally came to an end when local police cars pulled up outside the diner. Their flashing blue and red lights reflected off the old brick walls, pulsing as if marking the exact moment justice arrived. The three bikers who had started the trouble men who moments earlier thought they owned the room with their laughter and violence were now handcuffed and let out one by one. There were no arguments, no resistance, only lowered heads and eyes that avoided every gaze around them. As they passed the old man, not one dared lift his face as if a single look from him would remind them of something far greater than they had ever understood. When the door shut behind them, the diner fell into a different kind of silence. No tension, no heaviness, only a quiet respect spreading from table to table. Then a customer stood up and raised his glass. It was a small gesture, but enough to make the entire diner follow. They lifted their cups toward the old man in the wheelchair, the man who that very morning had made them reconsider everything they once took for granted. The customer spoke softly, his voice deep and sincere, to the old man. The words carried no hint of mockery. They sounded like a greeting, a thank you, an apology, and a tribute, all wrapped into 3 simple syllables. When everyone in the diner raised their glasses with him, the room felt connected by a single emotion, the kind that only rises when people witness the true dignity of another human being. The old man didn't smile, didn't offer a grand gesture. He merely bowed his head slightly, a nod so small that only those watching closely would notice it. Yet that quiet nod carried more weight than any applause ever could. Then without fuss, he turned back to his plate of cold eggs. No complaints, not even a furrowed brow. He simply resumed his breakfast as if everything that had just happened was ordinary, as if his life had seen things far greater and far more terrifying than anything that morning had offered. His aged hands held the fork with a calm steadiness, continuing the meal, as though the chaos had never torn through the room at all. Sunlight streamed through the window, falling across his chest, where the dagger tattoo and the number 182 held an entire story few people would ever have the courage to hear. The light rested on his skin like a sacred emblem not meant for display, but as a reminder to the world that there are people who live unseen, carrying the safety of strangers on their shoulders. A waitress nearby lifted a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the emotion rising within her. To her, he was no longer the old man in the wheelchair. He had become a symbol of everything beautiful that America sometimes forgets to honor. The customers sat back down, but no one spoke loudly. Every movement softened, every gesture gentler, as though the entire diner feared disturbing the quiet peace he had restored. Even the seals remained still, keeping their respectful distance yet standing ready like silent shadows of loyalty. In that moment, the little roadside diner was no longer a diner. It became a place where respect was restored, where mistakes were acknowledged, where dignity returned to its rightful place. A moment none of those present would ever forget, because they knew they had witnessed a piece of their nation's legacy, not in a museum or a ceremony, but in an ordinary morning beside a quiet old soldier. As the final ray of sunlight touched his tattoo, the story seemed to close itself, leaving behind an echo that settled deep into every heart. And then a warm voice rose, gathering the entire moment into a single message. If this story reminds you that honor and kindness never retire, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Stories of brave veterans, we remember the quiet heroes.
I just want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you. Folded hands, your love, support, likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the world to me. Without you, this journey wouldn't be possible. Every view, every share, and every encouraging word keeps me motivated to create more content for you all. I'm truly grateful to have such an amazing community by my side. Let's keep growing together and making this journey even more special. Red Heart.